The point you make about this possible turning in American historical memory, the need for innocence, it raises the question for me as to how our narrative and those things that our narrative incorporates, how that narrative as a national narrative differs from other national narratives. If I think about the Russian national narrative, and issues of suffering are seen as central to that narrative. The losses of World War II in the tens of millions of people were assimilated as somehow, unfortunately, part of the natural order, at least in the Russian seeing of things. National narratives can differ very dramatically in terms of how they see the world and how they anticipate and interpret events.
There's no question about that. In fact, wars in particular are often the hinges of how official national narratives are developed. Every nation in modern history, when it becomes a nation, has a creation myth immediately, and there's usually a national museum created that tells you that national story. But yes, the Russians lost 20 million people roughly in World War II. Talk to the Russians about tragedy. I remember once, I taught in Germany 15 years ago for a year. I used Ken Burns' film series on the American Civil War. It had just come out a year or two before I went. I showed it to my German students. And one of them came out, I'll never forget this, a German student came up to me and he said, "This was a colossal, bloody civil war you had, but why are there so many moonrises and sunsets in this film?" He says, "Because when we deal with war in our, there are no moonrises and sunsets." And I never forgot that, because it was of course a very good question. What kind of narrative was Ken Burns trying to fold that our Armageddon, he called it that, into, but a narrative that in the end was an America that, whatever happens to us, however horrible and bloody an experience we must have, however divisive, we always heal. We always get better. We became bigger and larger, and we solved our problems. Now, you could argue that it's a great thing that we have in America essentially a national narrative that seems invulnerable to attacks, and that is a narrative of progress. Somehow America must always come back to the center and be the city on a hill, a shining light to the world, a model. There are reasons for that. But if you look back into our past, at some of our worst mistakes, at some of our bloodiest experiences, what if we had had a deeper sense of tragedy? Lincoln had a sense of tragedy. It's why he didn't celebrate in the second inaugural when the war was virtually over. He could have, the greatest speech ever given by an American president could have been a celebratory, chest-pumping victory speech, but it isn't about victory at all. It's about the essential, genuine character of the tragedy we were experiencing. And he said it's a tragedy for all sides in this. Now, different nations have experienced, of course, different histories. Talk to the Poles about a sense of tragedy, Germans about a sense of tragedy, African nations that have been through, I mean, you could trace 4 generations in some African nations, and they've lived from colonialism through independence, through 2 or 3 bitter, terrible dictatorships, struggling in some cases into democracies through 3 or 4 generations. Now, how do we understand how do we understand collective, national memory in a place like Rwanda? Where do they put that experience? Do they have a sense of progress? Nations are founded on decoded stories that people believe they're living in. And I don't think we can kill this sense of progress in America, even if we wanted to. And I'm not suggesting we should. I'm glad young people grow up with a sense of hope in the United States, especially in this economy. But they need to grow up understanding that our history is full of tragedies like anybody else's. Go talk to the Navajo about whether history is just progress. Go talk to surviving Native American groups about whether history is only progress. And so I think sometimes we actually do ourselves a disservice by suggesting And here I would make a guess that most Americans, I can't prove this, but most Americans still want from their history essentially a story of triumph, of progress, of a place, a story of a place that in the end makes us feel good. Now, I'm not against that. You know, I'm not against a happy story, whether it's on the History Channel or in a textbook. But it's not honest unless we also understand that whatever institutions we create, however democratic in one case, however totalitarian in another, it's still human beings. And tragedies, genuine, sometimes faded, no-exit tragedies happen in all kinds of societies and cultures. No one's immune. Maybe 9/11 becomes that example, maybe, over time, that Americans just have to keep transmitting to the next generations that we are not immune. As though we shouldn't have known that, frankly, from Vietnam, from the Second World War, from the age of capital and labor, which led to tremendous strife, as though we shouldn't have known that from our Civil War, as though we shouldn't have known that from the wars on the plains against the Indians. We lost our innocence in this country 3 or 4 times, and we always keep getting it back.